I don't remember the exact moment I stopped being a boy and started being something more complicated. Memory doesn't work that way. It doesn't hand you a single frame and say, "Here, this is where everything changed." Instead, it gives you fragments, a smell, the texture of fabric, the particular silence of a house when everyone else has left. I was perhaps 9 or 10 when I first noticed that the world had rules I hadn't been consulted about. Boys were loud. Boys didn't linger. Boys didn't stand in front of mirrors and wonder what it would feel like to be softer, to be seen differently, to carry themselves through a room like water rather than stone. I wasn't loud. I lingered. And I stood in front of mirrors far too long for anyone's comfort, including my own. My mother was a quiet woman who kept her feelings folded neatly, like the clothes in her drawer. She never raised her voice. She expressed love through order. Iron collars, meals at fixed hours, a home that smelled like cedar, and something floral I couldn't name until I was much older. Lavender. It was always lavender. I used to sit in the hallway outside her bedroom and breathe it in like it was a second language, one I understood instinctively but wasn't allowed to speak. School was its own kind of pressure. Not violence, nothing so dramatic. Just the constant, low hum of expectation. The way other boys moved through the world with such certainty, as if they had been handed a map at birth that I never received. They knew how to stand. They knew how to laugh at the right things. They knew how to be enough without trying. I was always trying. I was always, quietly, failing at something I couldn't name. I was 14 when I first touched something that wasn't mine to touch. My sister had left a blouse on the back of a chair, cream-colored, with small pearl buttons and a collar that folded over itself like it was keeping a secret. I don't know what made me pick it up. Curiosity, maybe. Or loneliness dressed up as curiosity. I held it for a long time, before I did anything else. I felt its weight, lighter than I expected. I felt the fabric, smoother than anything in my own wardrobe. And then, slowly, I pressed it to my face and breathed. It smelled like her perfume, yes. But underneath that, it smelled like care. Like something that had been chosen deliberately, worn with intention, treated as though it mattered. I didn't have many things in my life that smelled like that. Not yet. I put it back. I always put things back. That was the first rule of my private world. Leave no evidence. Disturb nothing. Remain invisible. If I was going to explore whatever this was, I was going to do it without anyone knowing. Not because I was ashamed, or not only because of that, but because I had already learned at 14 that the things most precious to you are safest when kept secret. I want to be honest about those early years because honesty is the only way this story makes sense. I wasn't confused about who I was attracted to. I wasn't confused about my gender in the clinical, categorized way that language sometimes demands. What I was confused about, what I was aching about, was the gap between the self I was allowed to be and the self that seemed to be waiting patiently somewhere just beneath the surface. That self was gentler, more deliberate, more careful with beauty. It wasn't a woman exactly, or not only that. It was something that existed between the definitions, in the unmapped territory where no one had thought to plant a flag. And, because no one had named it, I couldn't ask for directions. I had to find my own way there, slowly, over decades, through small and private acts that accumulated, over time, into something that felt like grace. The first thing I ever bought for myself, truly for the self I was building, was a simple cotton bra. White. Nothing elaborate. I was 23, living alone for the first time in a studio apartment with thin walls and a radiator that knocked all night like it was trying to get in. I had walked past the lingerie section of a department store 100 times before. I had looked. I had moved on. That particular afternoon, I didn't move on. I stood there for a long time. Longer than was probably reasonable for someone pretending to be casual. I touched the fabric of several things without picking them up. And then I picked up the white cotton bra, a simple, unadorned thing, more functional than beautiful, and I carried it to the register, and I paid for it, and I walked home. That walk home was one of the longest of my life. Not because anything bad happened. Nothing bad happened. But because I was carrying something new, not just the bag, but the beginning of a permission I had never quite given myself before. The permission to want. The permission to pursue. The permission to take the private self seriously enough to make it real, even in the smallest, most invisible way.
I didn't wear it that night.
I put it in the drawer, and I went to bed, and I lay there in the dark, listening to the radiator knock, thinking, it's there. It exists. I put it there. That means something. It meant the beginning. Living alone teaches you things that living with others never can. It teaches you the shape of your own silence. It teaches you which habits are genuinely yours and which ones you performed for an audience that may no longer even remember watching. It teaches you, if you're paying attention, that the person you are when no one is looking is the most honest person you'll ever know. I spent my late 20s constructing a life that looked, from the outside, like ordinary adulthood. I had a job that required a collar and a handshake. I had friendships built on sport and shared meals and the comfortable avoidance of anything too interior. I was, by most reasonable measures, functioning. I was present at the table. I laughed at the right times. I knew how to be enough. But my apartment was a different country. In my apartment, I moved differently. I took longer in the bathroom. I kept certain drawers with a particular care that had nothing to do with practicality and everything to do with ritual. The white cotton bra had been joined, over time, by other things, a soft camisole in pale gray, a pair of satin briefs I'd ordered online at 2 a.m. with my heart doing something complicated in my chest. Nothing flashy. Nothing theatrical. Just fabric chosen for how it felt against skin, for what it meant to be chosen. This is the part of the story that I think people misunderstand when they hear it secondhand. They imagine drama. They imagine transgression, some heated, reckless act of rebellion against the self society had assigned. But the reality was almost the opposite of dramatic. It was quiet. It was the quietest thing in my life. It was a Sunday morning ritual. Coffee first, then a shower longer than necessary, then the specific, deliberate act of choosing what to wear, not for work or for friends or for any version of myself that existed in public, but purely, entirely for me. I want to describe what that felt like because I think it's the heart of everything. It felt like setting down a bag you'd been carrying so long you'd forgotten it was heavy. It felt like the moment after a headache lifts when you suddenly notice that the air has texture and color again. It felt like a kindness I was finally learning to extend to myself after years of offering it freely to everyone else. I wasn't performing femininity. I wasn't trying to be something I'd seen in a magazine or a film. I was doing something far more private and far less definable. I was letting the part of me that responded to softness, to deliberateness, to care as a daily practice breathe. Just breathe. Without justification. Without a name tag. Without needing to explain itself to anyone, including me. The loneliness of those years was real, but I want to be careful not to overstate it. It wasn't a desperate loneliness. It was more like the particular quiet of a person who has chosen to do something important alone because the world hasn't yet made a public space for it. I was a gardener tending something in winter, not sad exactly, but patient, and sometimes cold, and very aware of the work. My relationships during this period were warm, but surface level in ways I didn't fully understand until later. I liked people. I was genuinely interested in them. But there was a room inside me with the door pulled shut, and I didn't know how to invite anyone in without first explaining what was in it, and I didn't have the language for that explanation yet. So I kept the door shut. I kept the room tidy. I tended it alone. It was around 27 or 28 that I started thinking of what I was doing as a practice rather than a secret. That shift in language mattered more than I would have predicted. A secret implies shame, concealment, something that must be hidden from the light. A practice implies intention, care, repetition with purpose. A practice is something you build. A secret is something that builds you, and not always in directions you'd choose. I started approaching my private rituals the way I imagine someone might approach meditation or physical training or the cultivation of any interior discipline. With regularity, with attention, with a willingness to notice what was happening rather than simply enduring it. On Sunday mornings, I would dress carefully, the camisole, the bra, sometimes a soft cardigan that I'd bought in a women's section and told myself was gender neutral, which it was, technically, because all fabric is gender neutral, if you're honest about it. I would make tea. I would sit near the window and read, or write in a journal I kept behind other books on the shelf. And I would feel, for those hours, completely real. Not a hidden self. Not a secret self. Just a self. Present. Whole. Wearing what it wanted to wear. Sitting in its own light. The world outside the apartment didn't know this person. But I was slowly, carefully learning to. 30 was a threshold I crossed with less ceremony than I'd expected. There's a cultural story about turning 30, some grand reckoning, some arrival at adulthood's full weight, but the truth was more gradual. What 30 brought me was not revelation but accumulation. I had been quietly building something for a decade. By 30, I was starting to understand its shape. The word gentle had become important to me in a way I hadn't anticipated. Not gentle as in weak or passive or without backbone, but gentle as in careful with living things. Gentle as in the particular intelligence of someone who has learned to pay attention. I had spent years watching people move through the world with force, demanding, asserting, occupying space loudly, and I had always found that mode exhausting to witness and impossible to sustain personally. My natural register was quieter than that. More attentive. More interested in texture than volume. And the practice I had built, the Sunday mornings, the soft fabric, the private rituals of care had been, I now understood, an education in gentleness. It had taught me to treat myself as something worth caring for, which sounds simple, which is, in fact, profoundly difficult for people who grew up learning to perform rather than inhabit themselves. I had a friend during this period, I'll call her Nadia, who was the first person I'd ever told anything real to about my interior life. Not the full story, not the drawer, not the Sunday mornings, but something adjacent to it, a confession made sideways, in the middle of a conversation about something else entirely. We were talking about performance, about the exhaustion of professional masks, and I said something like, I think I've spent most of my life being someone else's idea of what I should be. She looked at me for a moment. Then she said, What's yours? I didn't answer, but I thought about it for weeks. What was my idea of myself? Not the office self. Not the son at the family table self. Not the friend who laughed at the right times. The mine self. The self that existed in the Sunday morning apartment with the window light and the camisole and the tea. That self was, I'll try to say this accurately, more feminine than my public self, but not entirely. It was a blend. It was a particular combination of qualities that language kept trying to sort into boxes that didn't quite fit. It was attentive. It was sensory. It cared about how things felt, literally and figuratively. It found beauty in small, deliberate acts, a well-made cup of tea, a perfectly fitted garment, the particular satisfaction of something chosen rather than assigned. I started, around this time, to think about what I was doing as crossdressing, not because the label fit perfectly, but because it was the closest available word for the territory I inhabited. I didn't love the word. It implied a crossing, a violation of some border, a transgression of the expected. But I also recognized that society had drawn a border and that I was genuinely on the other side of it sometimes. So I accepted the word provisionally, the way you accept a map that's approximately right while knowing the terrain is more complex than any map can capture. What I rejected, firmly and with increasing clarity, was the shame that the word was often packaged with. I had done nothing wrong. I had harmed no one. I had, in the privacy of my own life, developed a practice that made me more present, more calm, more genuinely myself than I'd ever been while performing the acceptable version. The shame was a borrowed thing, someone else's discomfort that I had been handed as a child and had been carrying ever since without examining whether it was actually mine to carry. I began, carefully, to set it down. This is not a dramatic process.
I want to be honest about that.
You don't set down decades of borrowed shame in a single cathartic moment. You set it down in increments, and sometimes you pick it back up accidentally, and sometimes it takes years to notice you've been holding it again. But the intention matters. The direction matters. And my direction, from 30 onward, was unmistakably toward something I can only call self-acceptance, not as a destination, but as a practice, as ongoing and imperfect and necessary as any other form of daily care. The bra that had started all of this, or not started it but given it its first physical form, had long since been replaced. But I kept the original, white and slightly faded now, in the back of the drawer. Not as a relic exactly. More as a reminder. A reminder that the self that had stood in that department store, heart hammering, making the smallest possible act of self-affirmation, that self had been brave. Not in any way the world typically rewards, but brave nonetheless. I was learning to honor that bravery, to build on it, to let it become, slowly, the architecture of a life rather than just the secret of a Sunday morning. I am in my 40s now. The apartment has changed. The city has changed. Some of the people have changed, and some have stayed. What has not changed, what has, in fact, only deepened and clarified and become more fully itself, is the quiet, deliberate self I have been tending all these years. I want to describe my mornings now, because they're the most honest expression of who I have become. I wake without an alarm most days. I make coffee with a precision that is partly habit and partly ceremony. I shower with good soap, something that smells like cedar, which I chose consciously because my mother's lavender was always hers and I wanted a scent that was mine. I dress with attention. Some days that means a fitted blouse and soft trousers that exist in that comfortable space between gendered categories. Some days it means whatever is clean and functional. But on the days that matter most, the days I am most fully here, I dress with intention. I choose fabric for how it feels. I choose fit for how it allows me to move. I choose the whole morning for what it means rather than what it looks like. This is the gentle transformation that the title of this story promises. It is not a transformation of body. It is not a transformation of identity in any categorical, bureaucratic sense. It is a transformation of relationship, specifically my relationship with myself. I am gentler with myself than I was at 20. I am more honest. I am more patient with my own complexity. I no longer require that I fit into a single legible category in order to deserve care or comfort or the pleasure of fabric chosen for its softness. I have told more people over the years. Not everyone. Not dramatically. But the door that was shut in my 20s has been opened, gradually, to people who have proven themselves worth trusting. Some of them understand immediately.
Some of them take time.
All of the ones who matter have stayed. Nadia, who asked me years ago what my idea of myself was, she knows now. I told her on a walk one evening, the long version, the real version. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "That actually explains a lot of things about you that I always liked." We laughed. We walked. I felt the particular lightness of being known. I think about the boy who stood in the hallway outside his mother's bedroom, breathing in lavender, wanting something he couldn't name. I think about the 14-year-old who held the cream blouse and felt, for one electric moment, the weight of a different kind of care.
I
think about the 23-year-old who walked home from a department store with a white cotton bra and a paper bag, heart loud, permission just barely granted. I want to reach back to all of them and say, you were right to want what you wanted. Not because wanting makes something automatically correct, but because the wanting itself, the reaching toward softness, toward deliberateness, toward a self more carefully tended, that wanting was intelligence. It was a compass pointing toward the actual you, the one underneath the performance, the one who needed space and patience and time. The transformation that matters isn't visible in any photograph. It doesn't have a before and an after. It happened in the accumulation of Sunday mornings, in the education of gradual honesty, in the slow and imperfect practice of treating the interior life as something worth furnishing carefully. I am not finished. People like me are never quite finished because the project isn't completion, it's continuity. It's the ongoing daily choice to remain present to yourself, to keep the door open to your own complexity, to refuse the convenience of a simplified self in favor of the more demanding and more rewarding work of being genuinely, fully, quietly here. The bra in the back of my drawer is old now. The elastic has gone soft. It serves no practical purpose. But I keep it because it was the first physical object I ever placed in my own life as an act of pure self-recognition. Before I had language for what I was. Before I had community or clarity or any of the frameworks that make these conversations easier now. When I had only the wanting and the courage to take one small step toward it. That step was enough to begin. Every step since has been enough to continue. And the peace I carry now, The particular stillness of a person who has stopped fighting with themselves and started simply living. That peace is the destination I didn't know I was walking toward when I first picked up a piece of fabric that wasn't mine and felt, for a breathless moment, completely found. It is mine now. All of it. The softness,
The care.
the deliberateness, the gentle, private, persistent self that survived every year of silence and emerged, unhurried and whole, into the light.